Trying to define when a city becomes a city is no easy feat, with generally no real answer, for there is no clear definition as to what a city is. Some claim Jericho to be the oldest. While it may sneak in at second or third, on the list it is unlikely to be. Despite this loss of prestige, it was still first inhabited sometime between the 9th and 11th millennium BC. Given that modern humans evolved around 300,000 years ago, this makes it a 30th the age of the human race, an even more impressive feat when you remember that the last ice age ended around this time, and farming only became widespread, at most, a couple of thousand years earlier. However, we're not here to define which is the oldest city in the world, nor other inventions from 10,000 BC. We're here to discover the wonderful city of Jericho in all her ancient glory. Though not a permanent settlement, the area that would become Jericho became a popular location for hunter-gatherers from the Natufian culture to camp around 10,000 BC. With the eventual end of the Ice Age in around 9600 BC, continuous settlement became possible, and a small settlement developed around what we now know as the Ain as-Sultan Spring. By 9400 BC, a village of around 70 small clay and straw roundhouses had developed in an area now called Tel es-Sultan, or Tel Jericho, with a tell being a mound of ex-human habitation, a mix of rubbish and old buildings that accumulates over time to raise the ground level, creating an artificial hill, suggesting just how far back human habitation goes here. By 8000 BC, Jericho had a population of between a couple of hundred and several thousand, an area of about 40,000 square metres, and, most importantly, a wall. Not just a wall though, a wall with a tower. As unimpressive as this sounds, their discovery makes them the oldest city walls in the world, and the first stone monument in existence. The wall measures up to 2 metres thick and 5 metres high in places, surrounded by a massive ditch, 8 metres by 3, while the tower reached an awe-inspiring 8.5 metres tall. This would make it the tallest man-made structure in the world for the next 5,000 years. It has been suggested, probably correctly, that these were defensive structures to protect against a mixture of hostile hominids, wild animals, and the forces of nature. The tower has also been considered as a monument to the greatness of agriculture, a statue to proclaim, look at what we're capable of thanks to grass. For grass was a large part of the builders' diet, with the local populace growing both wheat and barley, though they still supplemented their diet with game from hunting. Gradually, the settlement depopulated until a second, new civilization was imposed over the remains of the old by an unknown invading peoples around 7000 BC. This time, the buildings were large, rectangular, multi-room affairs built round a central courtyard. Some even had an early form of terrazzo flooring. For those of you who, like me, haven't got a clue what terrazzo flooring is, a quick Google reveals it's one of those square floor panels you get about places made of chunks of rock set in cement, or in this case lime. A peculiarity of these buildings' inhabitants was their burial practice, where they would decapitate the dead before burying the body under the floor and remodelling the skull with plaster to look like the deceased. These heads were then kept in the aforementioned houses, a kind of grisly mantelpiece ornament, I suppose. This civilization lasted for around a millennia before fading from existence too. Jericho then probably endured about a 1,000-year period of little to no inhabitation. From around 5000 BC, many small settlements seemed to come and go, building, destroying and rebuilding her defences, until climaxing in around 2600 BC under the rule of the Amorites from Syria. Their rule lasted only about 300 years though, before another 400 years of abandonment occurred. In 1900 BC, our old friends the Canaanites from the last episode appeared on the scene and established a city on the slowly growing Tell. In an event eerily similar to 1,000 years previously, Jericho reached her peak, again in the mid-16th century BC, before a rapid depopulation occurred. This disaster likely resulted from an earthquake accompanied by a fire. Archaeology suggests Jericho was once again abandoned for a further 600 years. However, the famed biblical Battle of Jericho reportedly took place 150 years into this void. Being that these events occurred over 3,000 years ago, perhaps a muddle of dates can be understood, in which case it is generally considered that the Battle of Jericho occurred, as previously mentioned, with Joshua's trumpets providing an analogy for the earthquake that destroyed the Canaanite city. Regardless of the validity or timeline of these events, she remained unpopulated until rebuilding work commenced in the 9th century BC. By the 7th century BC, she had developed into an Assyrian town of which little is known, only to be predictably destroyed once more, this time by the Babylonians under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century BC. This would be the last settlement on the Tell, with future settlements being moved several kilometres to the south. In the 320s BC, Jericho would come into the personal possession of Alexander the Great with his conquest of the region. With Alexander's untimely death, Jericho would be incorporated into his successor state of the Seleucid Empire, whose general Bahaidus built many forts in the area to protect from rebel forces. At some point during the dismemberment of the Seleucid Empire, she was seized by the Kingdom of Judea, only to be lost to the Romans during their invasion of the area, after which she was alternatively gifted and leased back to the Judeans depending on the whims of various imperial rulers. This was how she ended up under the control of Babysitter of the Year, Herod the Great, who, for all his infanticidal tendencies, oversaw an expansion in building, business and farming of the area. He even converted one of Bahaidus's fortresses into his winter palace, named it after his mother, and had his brother-in-law drowned there. So, a mixed record at best. After Herod's death, Jericho remained in the hands of Judea and became the site of several apparent miracles by Jesus Christ, including returning sight to the blind. That was until the Judean revolt in Jerusalem and its sacking by the Emperor Vespasian's son Titus in 70 AD. By 100 AD, it had become little more than a small garrison town in the mighty Roman Empire. And this is largely how she remained, attracting a few pilgrims and slowly growing until the Arab conquest of the 600s. In 569 AD, she was once more desolated by an earthquake. In response, the Arabs rebuilt her in an Islamic style, and she succeeded through the various successive dynasties until her capture by the Seljuk Turks in 1071. She would not remain for long under Turkish control, though, for she would fall to the Christians of the First Crusade in the 1090s, in whose possession she would remain for nearly 100 years. Under their guidance, she would experience a Christian revamp, gaining several churches and a monastery. Strangely, they also turned her into a centre of sugarcane production. With the defeat of the Crusader states at the hands of Saladin in 1187, she was returned to Islamic control and once more began the depopulation process. Though she was later incorporated into the Mamluk Empire, she seems to have changed little during this time period, but had important industries in banana, sugarcane and sulphur production. Indeed, I can testify to this banana industry, for even today you can still see and buy many bananas from the stalls around the city centre. In 1517 she was incorporated, along with the rest of Palestine, into the Ottoman Empire, under whose yoke she would remain for the next 4 centuries. Despite the fertility of her surrounding lands, she continued to shrink until her population totalled a little more than 50 households. And, with the exception of the occasional Bedouin raid, this is how she would remain until after the war to end all wars. When the Ottoman Empire fell in 1918, she came under the British Mandate and gradually started to grow once more. Despite another earthquake in 1927, her population finally reached over 1,500 by 1931. When the Second World War came to the region, a fortress was built nearby in preparation for an Axis invasion that never came. After the end of the British Mandate and the conclusion of the following Palestine War, the whole of the West Bank, including Jericho, came under Jordanian rule until the Six-Day War, nearly 2 decades later, saw her incorporated into Israel instead. 17 years after that, she was handed over to Palestinian control in accordance with the Oslo Protocols. A bit of politics I neither really understand nor am going to attempt to explain. Despite several Israeli raids, life in Jericho has been largely stable ever since, though reminders of the ongoing conflict are not far away. The first thing to greet me on entering the reception to my hostel was an old photo of Zona, aged 11 or 12, smiling, holding a Kalashnikov. Israelis are forbidden to enter the city. Doing so will, as a road sign ominously informs me, be dangerous to their lives. Meanwhile, Israeli fighter jets seem to regularly screech overhead. Though she's existed for a lot longer than our previously discussed Jaffa, and has seen several successive empires come and go, Jericho nonetheless has had a relatively peaceful history, not changing hands anywhere nearly as many times as the other great cities in the region, and enjoying centuries and millennia of calm at times. This serenity, however, does not detract from her history, and indeed adds to her beauty. Being situated at 253 metres below sea level, she is the lowest city in the world and is surrounded by mountains, giving her the feeling of being centre stage in some god's theatre. Her fellow actors being the green fields that supported the barley and wheat of her first cities, then later on her legendary banana and sugarcane crops. Perhaps her most ubiquitous crop, however, is her palm trees, which lend her the title of City of the Palms. Of course, none of this agriculture would be possible without her Aynas Sultan Spring, which, even today, is so vitally important to all settlers in the area. Not only does it feed the fields of these vitally important food crops, but also many sweet-smelling flowers, from which she receives her name, for it is thought she is called after the Canaanite word for fragrant. Last night I sat on the ruins of King Herod's Cyprus castle, watching the sunset over Jericho's 20,000 inhabitants, another spectator to her odyssey. I wonder what the future holds for this beautiful ancient city, once more on the front lines of Middle Eastern conflict. Will she still be here 12,000 years from now? I do hope so.